Well, good evening. Welcome to our Friday night Bible study. This is for Friday, January 24, 2025. And that means that we will have exactly one more of these Friday night Bible studies in January because a week from the 24th is the 31st. And then the plan will be, since the very next day is the first day of February, that we will do a sermon presentation then, which means that then we would have a sermon presentation scheduled for the 1st of March. And so in this year, March will be the month that has two sermon presentations in it, since we generally work to do one every 4 weeks. So I haven't decided the topic yet, but probably will have to in the next 24 hours when I get started on preparing the sermon presentation for next week.
Do you know what today is?
No, what is today?
Special day, and you don't know what it is?
I don't know what the topic will be yet, no.
Today is the eve of my half birthday. Where's my present?
Half birthday. In other words, half a year since your birthday,
That's right. Where's my present?
huh? I don't know. Anyway.
Think about that, dude.
Yeah. Well, then, not a lot to say about what's going on. I didn't go out today. I think it was yesterday or maybe it was Wednesday when I was out. No, I think I had to go out yesterday. Um, um, I looked in the front yard, and in the part of the yard that's north of the house that's still shaded, there was just a little bitty bit of snow left on the ground, but everywhere else the snow's all melted away. So that's what happened to the weather here. However, it has been cold. We knew last week that we were expecting a polar blast pretty much over the entire eastern United States, including our area, and it has been so. I heard somebody talking today that it's cold all the way down to Key West. So yeah, it has been chilly, but everybody seems to have survived. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time about that because I have some things I want to say once we get going this evening before we actually get into the texts. So I think what we need to do is just go ahead and have our word of prayer right away, and then we'll get moving. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for your blessings, and we thank you that we've made it through another week. We thank you for the wonderful things that you've done in our lives over this past week. And while we appreciate that, we know that there's a lot more to do. And when we take this time apart and open the written word, we want to draw closer to you. We want to understand you better. And we know that that process is very much enhanced when your spirit comes close and enters each person's heart. So we ask that each person might be enabled to do that, and that you will send your spirit toward that purpose. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. So we kind of stopped in the middle of a story last week. So we might actually just back up a little bit once we get into the text itself. The story that we kind of stopped in the middle of was the story of Saul and the Amalekites. And we talked a little bit about Samuel's order, which he claimed came from God, to essentially commit genocide against the Amalekites. And we got to the point where they were supposed to commit herem, Herem or Cherem is how it's very often anglicized. That's a transliteration from the Hebrew. The Hebrew term that refers to giving something irrevocably to God, often by totally destroying it. So Saul was asked to engage in herem, or to commit the entire Amalekite nation, all the people and all the animals, to God through herem. And Samuel interpreted that to mean totally destroying them. And then we got to the point where the Israelite soldiers kept some of the better animals for themselves, and Saul used the excuse, well, we're going to offer them as sacrifices. And we pointed out that in herem, whatever you gave to the Lord through herem was totally destroyed. You didn't get any of it for yourself. If you offered an animal as sacrifice, except for a complete burnt offering, if you offered it as sacrifice, you got to keep at least some of the meat of the animal as food for yourself and your family. And so we pointed out that what the people were doing was essentially, instead of giving the best to God, they were giving the worst to God by committing the herem against the poorer animals, but then keeping the best ones for themselves. So they were doing essentially exactly the opposite of what they should have done according to the protocols and symbolism of their time. Now, I wanted to take a moment to ponder a couple of character studies here. And these character studies would be of Saul himself and of his son, Jonathan. We wonder what happened to Saul. And I think last week we talked about the difference between the Saul who hid in the baggage when he was named as Israel's king, to the Saul we see at the end of his life fighting to retain his own dynasty, trying to kill David, and all the other things that were going on. And the picture that we get of him from about the point where we are in the story now, but even before this, in the incident with the oath not to eat until the battle was over, that these things demonstrated mental illness on Saul's part. That for some reason now he was no longer all there. Now, one of the questions we might ask ourselves is the change in the observable behavior due to a change in character, or are we seeing a case where the earlier Saul had his mask firmly in place and was able to make himself look good, but once his mental illness advanced and began to take over, he lost his mask and the real Saul began to shine through? I'll offer both approaches as possibilities to explain the evidence that's given to us in the narrative of what's happening in Saul's life. Perhaps he did have a character of humility and of a recognition of the fundamental equality of all humans, and something changed him so that he no longer had that sense. His character actually changed. I mean, we believe that through the power of God, our characters can change for the better. That's the whole hope of the atonement, is that God can take our broken, messed up characters and fix them and make us back into the godlike image in which He created us. Genesis 1, right there near the end, where it says God created humanity, male and female. He created them in the image of God, and He made both of them in the image of God. So we were created to be in God's image. We are intended and designed to be in God's image. And when we look around the world and we look at the people who control the world, we say to ourselves, no, that's not what God's like. So
I think it's important there to point out, at least this is my opinion, that the image of God does not mean physical appearance.
no,
God is the embodiment of love. We're not.
but we're supposed to be.
What?
But we are supposed to be. And that is the promise of restoration of the human race through the atonement of Christ, that God will reform us and restore in us that godliness image that we were supposed to have from the beginning. So character can...
It's not what we need to focus on when it says that we were created in His image. Who cares what He physically looks like? It's not important. What's important is to know that being created in His image is His character. We were created to have a Christ-like character.
And in order to get us back there, that character has to change. So the point I'm making is that character change is possible. I think I've mentioned this before. Go ahead.
Not by us. We cannot change our characters.
Well, yeah, we can't make the right change ourselves. I think we can change our characters if we get too carried away in self-preservation. But that won't take us in the right direction. So we need help to get to go the right direction. But yes, the character has to change in order for us to reach the restoration that God designs to make possible for us. So I think it is also possible for someone to start from a broken condition that is perhaps less broken than other people around them, and end up in a condition in which their brokenness is worse than the brokenness of the people around them. And that is possible in what happened to Saul. Either A, his character changed, or B, as his mental illness advanced, his mask fell off, and we saw the real Saul behind the mask that was on and in place earlier.
Yeah, he may not have been able to handle the stress of his job.
Well, here's what I think happened, and there is evidence for this that I'll mention as I get to that part of the story. That at the beginning, Saul wasn't really keen on the idea of being a leader. He wasn't sure he could do it. And so when he got chosen by Lot, he hid in the baggage, so as hoping not to be found, which didn't work. But at any rate, so he takes on the role because that's what everybody wants. And when he hears the news about what is it Nahash, king of the Ammonites, I think that's his name, is about to do to the people of Jabesh Gilead, he believes that he needs to take action, and he does so, and he's successful. And the result of that is the adoration and adulation of the people. And they meet together and they reaffirm him as their king. And everybody's all, eyes agog. Wow, this guy's great stuff. Yeah, we definitely want him to be our king. And he's there soaking all this in. And I think that point may have begun the process of his undoing. And he began to bask in the adulation and admiration of the people. And he began to desire and feel comfortable in the trappings of his role as a leader, including wearing the status symbols that demonstrated his superiority over his fellow Israelites, the royal robes. And this whole process then began to eat away at his mental stability, because this then became an obsession for him. He wanted more of it. Why do I say that? Well, in part, what happens later when the ladies sing this little ditty? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. How did Saul react to that?
Jealous.
Oh, yeah. That galled him, that someone else should steal some of his spotlight. And I think that is evidence to us that the adulation of the people was something he had become addicted to. And he couldn't imagine either himself or his heirs falling out of that position. So when his dynasty was challenged by the appearance of David on the scene, and we'll probably get into that part of the story before long here, even this evening. When he gets to that point, he can't stand it, and he takes action to prevent it from happening. And he slips in and out of the hold that this addiction has on his thinking processes and his behavior and his activity. And we'll see him slipping forwards and backwards as we go through the rest of this story. Now, that has to do with the character of Saul. What about the character of Jonathan? And how did the son of this mentally ill man at some point turn out to be who he was? Now, first off, we understand from the story that we read last week about the confrontation with the Philistines when he went to the cliff, and he and his armor bearers, he said to his armor bearer, we're going to go up there, we're going to reveal ourselves where they can see us. And then if they tell us to wait there and they'll come get us, then we'll know that God isn't going to go up with us. But if they tell us, come up here, then we're going to go up there. We're going to take that as a sign from God that we should go up there. And of course, they did say, come up here and we'll teach you a lesson. And Jonathan and his armor bearer climbed the cliff, got up there, and knocked down about 20 Philistines. And Philistines got scared and ran. And Saul then called out his army, and all the rest of that story took place. So Jonathan was a person who was willing to take initiative. He was willing. He also had. I thought of this earlier. Now I can't think of the term I want to use. He had a willingness to go forward when he believed that God would back him up in what he intended to do. A willingness to move forward when called on to move forward. But we also know, and we haven't gotten to this part of the story yet, but I think most of you know the story well enough to know this, that he will become very good friends with David. And everybody kind of knew, because I think Samuel had at some point let the cat out of the bag, that God intended, or Samuel intended, and God would bring it to pass, that David would replace Saul as king of Israel. Which means that as crown prince, Jonathan, the oldest son of Saul, would have been crown prince and eligible to become king in his father's place. David was the usurper who would replace him. And yet Jonathan makes friends with him. And he even tells him, I know that God is going to make you king, and you're going to be king and I'm not, and that's okay with me. What was it about Jonathan's character that made him willing to go along with that?
He didn't see power as a thing all that important to hold. He was more interested in the people he loved.
Well, clearly, he saw something in David that attracted him. There was something between them that they had in common, and that may have been their devotion to the Creator that made Jonathan willing to say, if this is what God wants. And that may even have been kind of part and parcel of his willingness to take action in the case of the battle with the Philistines. He believed God wanted him to do something, he did it. So if he believes that God wants David to become king, and that means he's not, then he's willing to do that out of his devotion to the Creator. But here's the wild thing now. We see Saul, whose corruption of character gets revealed increasingly throughout this story, and Jonathan, whose nobility of character is also revealed in this story, and both of them die on the same day in the same battle. And then we recall what Jesus said there as recorded in Matthew 5. God makes his sun to rise on the evil and the good. He makes his rain fall for the wicked and the righteous. And Then there was something else that Jesus said at some point. He mentioned two incidents. He mentioned a slaughter by Pilate and a human structural disaster, namely the Tower of Siloam. In both cases, people died. And Jesus said, do you think that these people were somehow worse off than the ones who didn't die? And Jesus said, no, they weren't. You know, things happen, disasters take place, people die. We are not to presume either superiority or inferiority on people because of the outcome at the end of their lives. How do they die? Oh, he was a great man. He died of natural causes. He died in his sleep. As opposed to he died in a natural disaster, or he died in an accident, or he died doing something stupid.
Alcohol poisoning.
Yeah.
He died of a heart attack.
Yeah. The the end, how shall I put this? The mechanism of our demise is not a judgment on our character. Good people do stupid things. And so it is likely that since every once in a while doing something stupid costs you your life, that both good people and bad people do stupid things that end their lives. So we're not to pass judgment on a person's character based even on something as seemingly obvious as they did something stupid and died as a result. Now, let's switch to this view and bring up our Bible text. And I have scrolled down, this is in 1 Samuel 15, to the point where we ended. And I wanted to reread the text that we more or less closed on. This is one of the memory verses that I learned as a child. The second part of verse 22, specifically. We learned it, of course, in the King James Version. To obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. And it reads here, and this is Samuel's reply, and it is given poetically, and Samuel, being a prophet, may well have used poetic language from time to time to express the words of God. So Samuel replies here, what is more pleasing to Yahweh? Your burnt offerings and sacrifices, or your obedience to his voice? Now, this was said in a very specific context. Saul has just told Samuel, well, yes, the men kept some of the best animals, but they're going to offer them as sacrifices. And Samuel says, you think that's going to please God? Does he want your sacrifices? Or does he want your obedience? Does he want you to fulfill the vows you make? Or does he want you to play loose with your vows in order to bring him something that he doesn't need?
And with that, fast forward to the text where he's asking them, and you can hear the tears in his voice. Who told you to do all this sacrificing? It wasn't me.
Yeah. So then Samuel's statement goes on, listen, obedience is better than sacrifice, and submission is better than offering the fat of rams. And then he continues, rebellion is as sinful as witchcraft, and stubbornness as bad as worshiping idols. So, because you have rejected the command of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. And you sense the word play there. You've rejected God, God's rejected you. This is Samuel's approach to things, but that's the wordplay that he's engaging here, and he's saying that in the way he has carried out the command he got through Samuel, that he has demonstrated that he's willing to place his own judgment ahead of the instructions he receives. Which I think is why that term stubbornness is put in there. What's stubbornness? Well, essentially, stubbornness is unwillingness to change. We're broken people. We need to have a character transformation in order to be reformed in the image of God and be restored to the path of life. That's necessary. But when we get carried away in our own ideas of what we ought to be, and with a sense of our own goodness, then we become stubborn and we resist change. Well, this is not what we've always believed, so no, we're not going to go there.
But stop and think about it. You're a victim of what you were taught in early childhood.
Well, absolutely. Because the very nature.
Imposed upon you.
Did you say the ideas that are imposed on us?
I said your beliefs were imposed upon you.
Well, by the very design of humanity, and I think this design goes right back to creation, we are designed to accept our worldview from our parents. So it is very difficult for a child to believe that mom and dad could be wrong. And that's why, the courts, when they deal with divorced parents and how are they to deal with the kids, courts are very adamant that the parents not run each other down, because that's exceptionally hard on the children, because part of their very design is to accept what their parents say and to accept that their parents are right. And now you've got one parent telling the children that the other parent is a terrible person. You're damaging your children when you do that.
All right.
And it doesn't matter whether the other person is or is not a terrible person. For you to promote that in front of the children damages them, whether it's the truth or not.
Super parent that you are, what does a parent do when they want to teach their child that what the other parent is doing is not right? It's wrong.
What is the best teaching someone can do? Admonition or example? I said, what is the best teaching you can do? Admonition or example?
the same time, the child needs to know that this is not proper behavior. It's not okay to be a bully. It's not okay to mistreat other people.
But that needs to be said in a context that separates the person from the behavior.
Yes.
Do you understand the difference there then? You're not saying, well, your dad's a bad person because he beat mother. You're saying what dad did to mother is wrong without casting judgment on who daddy is. We left because he crossed boundaries he shouldn't have crossed. He should not have done that. But that's not putting him down as a bad person. That's just saying the particular behavior was not conducive to good relationships. And I'm thinking in particular, and I won't name names or even the context in which it was, I knew somebody who was involved in an institution that I was involved with as a young person, and he was married and had 2 daughters. And even though this was a religious context, at some point he divorced his wife. And then, somehow, he managed to keep the 2 girls, and he proceeded to badmouth his wife to those 2 daughters until they believed that their mother was an evil and wicked person. And I don't know all the facts of the thing, but I just, when I hear these things today, I remember that person and what he had done to his daughters. And I think, he really put his daughters in a bad place. And it is an unfortunate thing that very often, once there's been a divorce, the parents are prone, because they're human beings, to want to use the children as pawns to engage in spite against what they perceive as the party who wronged them. And both sides generally believe they were right and the other one was wrong. So they both see themselves as the innocent party. So they both think it's okay for them to badmouth the other partner to the children. So the children have whichever parent they're not with at the moment badmouth to them. That's bad news. That destroys the children. Now, another thing that I wanted to talk at this point, and we still haven't gotten into moving forward in the text. We've been talking about character change, and we've suggested that it's possible that Saul's character changed over time, that someone who had a less broken character had his character become more broken through time as he became addicted to the trappings and adulation of the people associated with his royal position. But we also talked about the necessity of change in the other direction, that we need healing, and that healing involves change. And we speak of a process we call conversion. Now, in a religious context, very often as taught to us by religious institutions, conversion is the point at which you sign on the dotted line, to join that particular religious organization. Well, that may not be that might be conversion. You might pass from not accepting the creator as part of your life to accepting the creator as part of your life in the context of changing a religious affiliation. But it is very possible to change religious affiliation and not change anything else at all. And in that case, there's no conversion. It's just, as somebody's put it, you're just switching addictions.
Oh, that makes me think of baptism.
Yeah.
I have the belief that getting baptized gets rid of the sin.
Baptism. Baptism. Nobody's heard anything that both of us have said for the last 20 seconds because every time I say something, you say something. So I'm going to stop. You say what you want to say.
What you said makes me think of some of the beliefs out there on baptism, that it's nothing more than a magical dunk. D-U-N-K. If you take that magical dunk, you no longer are a sinner. And yet, when you have that, when you've been baptized and you continue sinning, yet you're no longer a sinner, that doesn't exactly make sense.
No. Baptism is a symbol of cleansing from sin. It's made possible when we surrender ourselves to our Creator through Jesus Christ. But it's only a symbol. The baptism itself doesn't remove sin. That's the work of the Holy Spirit. Once we surrender ourselves in trust to the Creator. The baptism doesn't do the job. It just symbolizes what's supposed to be taking place. So being baptized doesn't guarantee that the transformation takes place. Conversely, not being baptized does not prevent that conversion and that transformation from taking place. You don't have to be baptized in order for God to save you. Now, is baptism a valuable rite and symbol? I would say yes. But it's just a symbol, nothing more. Now, I wanted to go a little bit further in this concept of conversion because we talk about a concept, sanctification. Now, those who believe in sovereign grace generally take a negative view of sanctification. Either God saves you, has saved you, or He hasn't saved you. That's His choice. And so a person who believes in sovereign grace will talk about when God saved them, but they will usually point to some event or point in their lives when God did this thing, but then they also teach that that is not by human choice, that's purely by sovereign choice. But if that's the case, then God made up His mind what's going to happen to you before you were born. So that's when your conversion took place, when God made up His mind, and that was before the creation of the world. So how can you point to an event in your own life to say that's when your conversion took place? When did God save you? Well, He saved you when He decided way back whenever it was that you were going to be saved and your brother was not, as an example. But the other problem that people run into when they think of this concept of conversion and sanctification is, they think, well, sanctification begins when you're converted and it ends either when you die or when Jesus comes. I'm going to suggest to you that sanctification may, in fact, have a beginning point, and we might call that point conversion, the point at which we realize the truth about God's character and come to trust Him and open our characters to His construction and transformation. But that process does not have an end, ever, for all eternity. And I think that's an important point as we ponder this whole bit about eternity. Because if eternity, we start out at a point and then we're at that point forever and ever without no end, things are going to get boring pretty quick, and then we're going to spend eternity being bored. But if there is a growth process that takes place until we reach eternity and then continues for all eternity, so that there are new heights of character to reach, new glimpses of God's character to grasp, new places to take ourselves and to develop our capabilities and our powers, then eternity becomes interesting, because there'll always be something new. And that is the nemesis to this concept of stubbornness. Because you cannot grow for eternity if you're resistant to change. Change is something that you have to get used to, because you're going to engage in it for all eternity. Because if you don't, eternity is going to get boring. At any rate, we took what? Pretty much half of our thing here, just discussing this one section and getting to the point where we're going to move forward in the story. So now we're here at verse 24. And get my cursor over here so that we can scroll the text up. Then Saul admitted to Samuel, and we wonder about this confession, if it was motivated by a recognition of his own failings and a willingness to change, or if it was, as I'm going to suggest, motivated by a desire to maintain his dynasty. So he says to Samuel, "Yes, I have sinned. I have disobeyed your instructions in the Lord's command, for I was afraid of the people and did what they demanded." Sounds to me like Aaron talking to his brother, talking to his younger brother Moses. Moses is saying, what's this I see? What's this image that people are carousing in front of? And he told his brother, well, I gathered all their gold and I dumped the gold into the fire and out walked this calf. I knuckled under, I did what the people wanted. So here's Saul saying, Samuel, well, I sinned, but it wasn't me, it was the people. I knuckled into the people and did what they demanded. So don't blame me. Blame deflection. Well, that's not much of a confession if you're going to deflect blame. There are a lot of instances in court where a plea deal is reached and the defendant is brought to the judge to enter that plea and have it recorded, and then to have sentence passed based on the plea agreement. And so the judge starts asking questions. What did you do that makes you think you're guilty of, whatever the offense is that they're pleading to? and they start trying to engage in self-justifications. And there are cases where judges will refuse to take the plea because the defendant is unwilling to accept responsibility. And what they'll say is, well, I can't accept your plea and sentence you if you don't think you're guilty. Let's go to trial. We'll let a jury decide. And sometimes that's exactly what happens. The plea deal gets vacated and dropped. The thing is, usually a plea deal involves a reduction in charges. So once the judge refuses to take your plea and you go to trial, the original charges are back on the table. And if you're then found guilty by the jury, you're in a worse situation than you were had you been able to accept responsibility for the reduced charge. But some people, that human drive for self-justification is so powerful that they find it hard to do what's in their best interest and admit responsibility. They're still in that self-justification mode. And so we see that here in what how Saul replies to Samuel. He's ready to take the plea. Yes, I've sinned. Okay, I'm going to plead guilty here. But I was afraid of people. I did what they demanded, so it's not really my fault. But now, please forgive my sin and come back with me so that I may worship the Lord. But Samuel replied, I will not go back with you. Since you have rejected the Lord's command, he has rejected you as king of Israel. As Samuel turned to go, Saul tried to hold him back and tore the hem of his robe. And Samuel used that as a metaphor. Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to someone else, one who is better than you. And he who is the glory of Israel will not lie, nor will he change his mind, for he is not human that he should change his mind. So one thing, God doesn't lie. He doesn't seek to gain tactical advantage by obscuring the truth. He lets the truth reveal the rightness of his cause. He lets the truth stand up for him. And that's why we're in the situation we're in right now, because God is letting things work out, and he's letting truth reveal itself through the events on this planet, so that he is not taking he's not taking revenge himself. He's simply letting truth reveal itself through the natural course of events. So God doesn't lie, and he doesn't change his mind. God is the only being in the universe who has reached what we might think of as total perfection. He does not need to change, so he does not change. And that unchangeableness is extremely important to life in the universe. Scientists have calculated, and I'm not sure what the calculations are, but a very low percentage of change in the force of gravity would make life impossible. Life is possible because the laws of physics, the principles that of chemistry that allow our bodies to work they do, these things do not change. If they were to change, we would all die. God's character is the foundation of our life. It cannot change, because if it did, life would no longer be possible. God does not change. And that's what we mean when we say his law doesn't change. We're not talking about, the law of the Medes and Persians is not allowed to change. And so even if a ridiculous law gets passed, well, you can't rescind it because the law can't change. That's not what we're talking about when we say God's law can't change. What we're saying is that the principles on which the universe was created cannot change, because if they did, life would no longer be possible. So Samuel asserts now the unchangeableness of God's character. And he may not have gotten around to making it clear why it isn't, but that it isn't, he very firmly states here. He who is the glory of Israel will not lie, nor will he change his mind, for he's not human that he should change his mind. He doesn't need to. Then Saul pleaded again, I know I have sinned, but please at least honor me before the elders of my people and before Israel by coming back with me so that I may worship the Lord your God. Yeah, he's kind of lost contact with his creators. It's not my God, it's your God. So Samuel finally agreed and went back with him, and Saul worshiped the Lord. His appearance before the people was important to him, and he was able to prevail on Samuel to come back and honor him that far so that he didn't lose face in front of the people. Then Samuel said, bring King Agag to me. Agag arrived full of hope, for he thought, surely the worst is over, and I have been spared. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Greek version read, Agag arrived hesitantly, for he thought, surely this is the bitterness of death. Well, you can kind of look at this from Agag's point of view. The powerful king of Israel has decided to wipe out his nation. And his armies have been powerless to ward off the attack from the armies of Israel. And he's found himself captured. But now, the man of God shows up. The king hadn't yet killed him, so he may well have thought that with the man of God showing up, he would be shown mercy. But then it says, but Samuel said, as your sword has killed the sons of many mothers, now your mother will be childless. And Samuel cut Agag to pieces before the Lord at Gilgal. Was Samuel acting in the character of God here, or was he acting in the character of the destroyer? Now, there may have been a human sense of justice in what happened, because he says, your sword has killed the sons of many mothers. Well, now your mother will be childless. And so he does to Agag what Agag had no doubt done to thousands of people in his past. Then Samuel went home to Ramah, and Saul returned to his house at Gibeah of Saul. Samuel never went to meet with Saul again, but he mourned constantly for him. And the Lord was sorry he had ever made Saul king of Israel. Now, this is a very strange verse, coming as close as it does to Samuel's assertion that God does not lie and he's not human, that he should change his mind. Now it talks like as if God changed his mind. Says the Lord was sorry he had ever made Saul king of Israel. Well, did God change his mind? Or was God simply responding to the situation that human history presents to him? Something he knew would happen and that he allowed to happen for whatever purpose he had. And yet, along with the people, he now mourns over the situation of his people as they endure life under a king who, as we will see, is increasingly mentally unstable. Next chapter. Now, the Lord said to Samuel, "You have mourned long enough for Saul. I have rejected him as king of Israel. So fill your flask with olive oil and go to Bethlehem. Find a man named Jesse who lives there, for I have selected one of his sons to be my king." But Samuel asked, "How can I do that? If Saul hears about it, he will kill me." Wow. Well, Saul may, in the previous chapter, Saul's begging Samuel to forgive him and come with him so he can look good in front of the people. And here's the man of God with me, helping me to worship God in front of you. So this shows that I'm still God's man as your king. But he may well have harbored resentment against Samuel for what he had said. And now God is telling Samuel, go anoint somebody else to be king. And Samuel knows enough about Saul to know that if Saul hears that I'm doing that, he's going to kill me. So Samuel has at this point recognized the character of Saul to the point that he realizes how far Saul will go trying to maintain his own dynasty. "Take a heifer with you," the Lord replied, "and say that you have come to make a sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you which of his sons to anoint for me." Which is going to explain some of what happens later in this chapter. This is being done surreptitiously. I addressed this story in a manuscript for a book that I wrote several years ago. And I approached this event from the viewpoint of the people of Bethlehem, who see that the prophet, the man of God, is coming to their city for a feast and a sacrifice, and they begin to discuss it among themselves. What's really going on here? And maybe there were some rumors that involved what had happened in the matter of the Amalekites, that there had been some tension between Samuel and Saul. So maybe what he's doing here has to do with that. By the way, just to point something out, very much later in the history of Israel, in the book of Esther, we read the story of someone called Haman, the Agagite. And one of the interpretations of that story is that not only did Saul spare Agag, the king of the Amalekites, but he also spared Agag's queen and his crown prince. And that as Samuel sliced Agag to pieces there at I forget the name of the place. Why don't I back up real quick and look at it, where it says that happened? Um, Gilgal. Okay. So as Samuel cuts Agag to pieces there at Gilgal, that his wife takes his child and manages to escape and flees Israel and goes to some other place. And that this then becomes the family of Agag, or the people known as the Agagites. And that interpretation then says that this event then explains Haman's hatred for Israelites. More specifically, the Jews who would come to Babylon and were left over in his day there in the kingdom of Persia. He hated them because he saw them as descendants of the Samuel who had cut his ancestor to pieces publicly, humiliating his family and making his own ancestor's life difficult as a result. And so what Haman sought to do to the Jews was related to this incident that we just read in the book of 1 Samuel. That's a possibility. I think you will find people who will question that interpretation and suggest that the Agag of Haman being an Agagite might be an entirely different situation. And Haman's anti-Semitism was just that, anti-Semitism. Here's these people doing well economically, and we tend to see, as humans in our greed, we tend to believe that if somebody does well economically, that's done at the expense of the people who aren't doing well economically. And so then we build up resentment against them, which is one of the foundations of anti-Semitism. The Jewish people as a whole tend to do well economically for a variety of reasons. And so it is easy to stir up discontent with them amongst people who feel that they're not doing as well economically as these Semitic peoples, and so they succumb to anti-Semitism and hatred, and express their hatred through violence. At any rate, we kind of got off our point here. Samuel now travels to Bethlehem, and he calls a sacrifice to the Lord, and he invites specifically Jesse to the sacrifice. When he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town came trembling to meet him. "What's wrong?" they asked. "Do you come in peace?" "Yes," Samuel replied, "I have come to sacrifice to Yahweh. Purify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." Then Samuel performed the purification rite for Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice too. When they arrived, Samuel took one look at Eliab and thought, "Surely this is the Lord's anointed." Remember that name. We're going to run into it later. We're going to see what kind of a person Eliab was. But Samuel looks at him and he thinks, well, this is great. And you would think Samuel would know by now because he'd looked at Saul and thought, Saul's going to be a great king. Look how that turned out. But now he's looking at Eliab and he thinks, well, yeah, this is Jesse's oldest son. Yeah, this is bound to be the one. But the Lord said to Samuel, don't judge by his appearance or height, for I have rejected him. The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Now, let's give people, humans, a bit of a break here. We judge by outward appearance because that's all we have to judge people on. And we use the saying, you can't judge a book by its cover. But when it comes to observing other people, the cover's all we ever see. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why Jesus said, don't pass judgment on one another. Let God do that. People judge by outward appearance. It's all they have to judge on. The Lord looks at the heart or the character. God looks at who we really are, outside of the masks we wear, outside of behavior that other people can see. Relatively good people can look bad to other people, and bad people, very bad people, can look good to other people because they very carefully wear a mask to make themselves look good. They're very careful in what they say and how they say it, so that they will appear good to other people. But that's all lies. It doesn't reveal what's really there. And God doesn't look at that. He looks at what's really there. He looks at what really motivates us. He looks at what we could do if we could get away with it. Then Jesse told his son Abinadab to step forward and walk in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, no, this is not the one the Lord has chosen. Next, Jesse summoned Shimea. But Samuel said, neither is this one the Lord has chosen. Now there's a footnote there for Shimea. Let's go see what that has to say. The Hebrew is Shema, a variant spelling of Shimea, and they ask us to compare a couple of texts out of the book of Chronicles where the genealogies are found. So, Eliab hasn't passed muster. Abinadab hasn't passed muster. Shimea hasn't passed muster. In the same way, all 7 of Jesse's sons were presented to Samuel. But Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen any of these. Then Samuel asked, are these all the sons you have? Well, they're still the youngest, Jesse replied, but he's out in the fields watching the sheep and goats. Now, let's think about that. There's an ageism taking place here. The oldest is the most important. The youngest is the least important. That's the thinking that we're seeing here. And the youngest has been so left out of even Jesse's calculations that when he's told to bring his sons to this religious feast before the man of God, he doesn't think to send a servant out to relieve the youngest of his duties. Furthermore, at this point, the people of Israel have succumbed to the bias of the Egyptians. Remember, when we read the story of Joseph bringing his family to Egypt, the Egyptians despised their herdsmen. That was a servant's job. That was a job for the lower class of people. Only the lower class of people tended the animals. The nobility didn't. They would eat the meat, but they didn't tend to the animals. That was for somebody else to do. So there was a lot of discrimination taking place in that thinking, and a lot of classist thinking going on. And that had now infected Israel. So the person who's out there watching the animals, tending to the sheep and goats, that's the one that's not worth anything. He's a lower class of citizen. He's a lower son. He's not worth the rights of the other sons. He's not coming to the feast of God before the man of God. He's still out there watching the animals. And that point gets made when we get to the story of the birth of Jesus. Because the angels come to earth to sing the praise of God at the birth of Jesus. And they don't present themselves to the priest, and they don't present themselves to Herod or to any of the royal officials. They don't present themselves to any of the important people of Israel. They present themselves to the shepherds, the lowest class of people in the nation. That's who hears the good tidings of the birth of Jesus. And they're the ones who listen. Herod, when he finds out, tries to kill him. The priests, when they find out, eventually succeed in killing him. With the shepherds, they went into the stable and worshiped the newborn king. So here's the situation of David. He's the youngest. He doesn't count. Jesse brought all his sons except the youngest, because the youngest didn't count. It didn't enter into his calculations. He was so disregarded that he was still out there watching the sheep and the goats. Send for him at once, Samuel said. We will not sit down to eat until he arrives. Now, this is certain to have sparked a level of resentment. Maybe they don't know why Samuel is there, but I think they sense that if the man of God has come to their town, something important is going on. And now to have him say, we can't eat until this boy that you have rejected comes in and joins with us. Well, we'll see in a little bit how they receive that. So Jesse sent for him. He was dark and handsome with beautiful eyes. And the Lord said, this is the one, anoint him. So as David stood there among his brothers, Samuel took the flask of olive oil he had brought and anointed David with the oil. And the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David from that day on. Then Samuel returned to Ramah. Now, the Spirit of the Lord had left Saul, and the Lord, Hebrew thinking here, sent a tormenting spirit that filled him with depression and fear. Footnote B there for the spirit, or an evil spirit. Well, yeah, a tormenting or an evil spirit. Mental illness is what's going on here. And while the destroyer, the enemy of the human race, probably had a hand in this, and may specifically have sent one of his cohorts to oppress Saul with depression and fear. The result is the things that we're going to read as we go forward. Some of Saul's servants said to him, "A tormenting spirit from God is troubling you." Remember, these are Hebrew people. If it happened, God did it. So now Saul's got this troubling spirit, this evil spirit, or this unclean spirit, as we would read in the New Testament, causing him problems. Well, God's done it. But maybe we can undo what God has done. Let us find a good musician to play the harp whenever the tormenting spirit troubles you. He will play soothing music, and you will soon be well again. All right, Saul said, "Find me someone who plays well and bring him here." One of the servants said to Saul, "One of Jesse's sons from Bethlehem is a talented harp player. Not only that, he's a brave warrior, a man of war, and has good judgment. He's also a fine-looking young man, and the Lord is with him." Now, at what point in the story this takes place, we can't be sure. But we can do some guessing. Saul reigned for 40, maybe 42 years. That's generally the assumption made from the evidence that we have. Of course, it's also possible that all of this takes place in the space of just 2 years, like the Hebrew says, and it was only later that the Jews began to think that there were a lot of more years in Saul's reign than just those 2. But whatever the case may be, we know that David was 30 when Saul and Jonathan succumbed in battle to the Philistines. And it does seem like we need more than 2 years for everything to take place that's going to take place in the rest of this first book of Samuel. So I'll leave that up to you to decide what you want to think. I think maybe the 42 years is a valid term, in which case we're well into the reign of Saul, because David wasn't even born until 10 years into Saul's reign, roughly. And so by this point, when he's old enough to be out tending the sheep, to be known as a talented musician, that's got to be closer to David at 15 or 20 maybe. So only about 10 or 15 years before the end of Saul's reign. We don't have an exact number. But sometime after, apparently, Samuel's visit to Bethlehem and the events that are about to come, this takes place. And at this point, it has become known that David is a talented musician. Now, harp, almost certainly not what we think of as harp. Maybe something more like a lyre, or who knows, some sort of stringed instrument probably, but exactly what it was we might not know. However, I wonder how many people knew that Samuel had anointed him, and even those who knew that Samuel had anointed him, how many of those knew what he'd anointed him for? But at any rate, he had the reputation at this point that the Lord was with him. And as we said back there when we read the story of Joseph, if the Lord was with him, then we can be certain that he was with the Lord. So Saul sent messengers to Jesse to say, "Send me your son David, the shepherd." Jesse responded by sending David to Saul along with a young goat, a donkey loaded with bread, and a wineskin full of wine. So he sends his son, and he sends a tribute to the king. That's what was expected in those days. So David went to Saul and began serving him. Saul loved David very much, and David became his armor bearer. Then Saul, sent word to Jesse asking, "Please let David remain in my service, for I am very pleased with him." And whenever the tormenting spirit from God troubled Saul, David would play the harp. Then Saul would feel better, and the tormenting spirit would go away. Now, we're about to read another story. And when we read that, we're going to get the impression that what is described here took place after the story we're about to read. Well, we're going to look at the evidence and think about it. I don't know. This story may be told to us out of order. It certainly seems to be. And I'm just checking the time here to see how much farther we can go. And we don't have a whole lot of time. And in fact, well, you can see here by the title, Goliath challenges the Israelites. You know what story we're about to read, but we don't have time to do the whole story. We don't even have time really to get into what's going on between David and his father and his brothers. But I will tell you that as we read this story, we are going to see evidence that the story we just read about the tormenting spirit and David coming to serve Saul as a musician apparently hadn't taken place yet when we get to this part of the story. Seems to be out of order. And next week, when we go on with this, we'll look at that, we'll look at the evidence, we'll think about it. But I'm looking at the time we have, and I'm saying that it's a couple of minutes short, but I think we need to go ahead, since we're at a chapter break, and call this off and continue this story next week, because I think this is a great story to start next week off with. So, we thank you for joining us. We invite you to join us again next week. That'll be the 31st of January. Of course, you can, we upload these to Facebook, so you can view them anytime you like. But until next time, whenever you choose to view this, we say to you, goodbye, and God bless.